We are on for video. We're going to begin to talk about the book of Galatians. Make sure that you not only have your notes downloaded, but you also have a chart downloaded that says Paul's books, Paul's chart, letters chart. Make sure you have that downloaded so that we will have that at the end of the lesson video. The author of Galatians really is virtually uncontested. That means a lot of scholars, no matter what side they may come from, believe that Paul wrote the letter. That's really not even up a discussion. It will be in some other books. But one of the big things that is up for discussion is who is the letter to? Now, we know that Paul's writing to Galatians, but there's really two sides to Galatia. There's what we call the northern Galatia view, and that these churches are in the northern area of what is called Gaul, and that Paul would have written that during his third missionary journeys. I'm going to put a map up here, which is not in your notes, but you can see. So really what we're talking about here, now remember, this whole area right here is what we call Asia Minor, modern day, pause for you to answer the question, Turkey. And so right here in the middle, we have different regions, but right here in the middle, we have the Galatia region. We have North Galatia, we have Southern Galatia. To put it in kind of context, we would say, I'm writing a letter to the Carolinas. Well, we have North Carolina, we have South Carolina. You know, which one is it to? You might sometimes you see the news out of Charlotte, it might say, the Carolinas are going to have this going on. Well, you're kind of talking in general both. And so the idea is that those who hold to a northern Galatia view, I mean that he's writing to the churches that are up in this area. Those would be, which we'll talk about, the southern Galatia would be this southern area right here. Now, the biggest discussion then comes from, because when is that book written? If it's written to the northern regions, it comes much later. If it's written to the southern region, it comes much earlier. And there's really a couple arguments that are used in the northern Galatia discussion, and that is one, some of the early church fathers held to a northern view. The natural meaning of Galatia would be in the northern area. There is some indication that in Acts chapter 6 and also in Acts chapter 18 that maybe indicates that Paul would have gone that way. In Galatia 2, chapter 1 through chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, is best harmonized that Acts is identifying the Jerusalem Council. Now, on the other hand, we're going to have the southern Galatia view. The churches of Galatia are the churches that Paul planted on his first missionary journey, and was written by Paul immediately before the Jerusalem Council. The Jerusalem Council was held in the beginning of Acts chapter 15, discusses whether or not those who are not Jewish coming to Christ need to also keep the Jewish tenets or become Jewish first, which they don't. That's what the Jerusalem Council settles. Now, I'm going to put another map up here, and this is the Galatia region. And so by this, what we see is on Paul's first missionary journeys, he went through these cities, Lystra, Antioch, Iconium, Derbe, turned around, came back, headed back home. Okay. Now, there's the arguments that are made for this side are this. One, we have no record of Paul ever going to North Galatia. Okay. Two, there's no record of Paul establishing any churches in that area. 3, The makeup of the collection delegation includes no northern churches. So, talking about the Jerusalem Council, there's no northern churches, no area that is included in that. The northern Galatia district is very isolated. There are no roads in that area. I'm going to show you that in a second. Paul uses just titles in general. So again, it might be to say, I'm from the Carolinas. I'm just using a general area. Okay? We live in the foothills. Well, that covers a lot of area. Alexander County, Burke County. Doesn't necessarily mean just Catawba County. Barnabas is mentioned in going in Galatia because he traveled with him to that area. No mention in Galatians of the Jerusalem Council or decision that had been met. That was a big decision that was made, and if that had been reached, that would have been mentioned to those churches in that area if it had come after Galatians comes after that. And then the number of visits in Galatians matches up with Paul's time in that. And then also the expansion of the early church and a better correlation between Acts and Galatians. Now, remember, the Romans were great at building roads. And a lot of major cities were built along the roads. And so, again, you see these cities here that Paul goes to. Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, all along a major trade route. Northern Galatia, no major trade routes. Paul's not going to go outside the major trade routes because the travel would have been a lot harder. It would have taken a lot longer. So what's at stake? Well, one, the day of the epistles. That's the biggest thing. The interpretation of Galatians chapter 2, then its value, the historical value of Acts, or whether that's correct or not, and then where is Paul in his thinking at this time. So for me, I believe that the Jerusalem Council can be dated right around AD 48. The letter to Galatians should be dated between the end of the first journey at the end of Acts chapter 14 and before the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. And so if you're reading or you're asked a question, I believe that the Jerusalem Council in the book of Galatians comes at that time, and the book of Galatians would have been before the Jerusalem Council, therefore holding to a southern view of the book of Galatians, and it being Paul's first missionary journey, right at the end of Paul's first missionary journey, and it is the first book that is written. So what's Galatians about? One is about false teachers. We're going to see this. We're going to see this in. Let me bring my pen up here. We're going to see this idea of false teachers. Whoops, I cannot write today. In a lot of the epistles, and when people are trying to talk about Christianity or things like that, there's always going to be false teachers, and Paul is going to address that in a lot of his letters. He's going to address Judaizers. Judaizers are Christian Jews who insisted on non-Jews taking on the Jewish mode of life, especially circumcision, if they were to be Christians. And that's what the Jerusalem Council discusses. And that's why, if the Jerusalem Council had already happened when Paul addressed the letter to the Galatians, he would have said, this matter has already been settled. Yet he's writing prior to the Jerusalem Council. And then a warning against what is called antinomianism. This is discussed in Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 through Galatians chapter 6. Antinomianism says that talks about moral libertarianism. The liberty from the law does not mean liberty to sin. It's really the idea that, hey, I can do whatever I want because God's already forgiven me, so I can just do whatever I want. That's the idea of antinomianism, and that's not the nature of what Galatians is talking about. And Paul's talking to him, say, listen, that's not the right thinking. Just because you've been forgiven by Christ does not mean you can go out and do whatever you want and then know that God's going to forgive you. The theme of Galatians is the justification by faith. And then the key verse is Galatians chapter 2, verse 16, which says this, nevertheless, know that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but through the faith in Christ Jesus. Even we who have believed in Christ Jesus, so that we may be justified by the faith in Christ and not by the works of the law, since by the works of the law no flesh will be justified. Now, this is where you want your chart to fill in the information. The date will be AD 48-49, just before the Jerusalem Council. He is writing to the churches in southern Galatia established during his first missionary journey. And in here, this is information that you're going to be using for your, where it says relationship to Acts, where you're going to be using for your Paul missionary journey project, whether you've watched that instructional video yet or not. You'll see this, and so it's going to go between the end of Acts chapter 14, after the last verse in Acts chapter 14, and just before Acts chapter 15, verse 1. He's writing from province, means this is where he's writing from. He's writing from the Antioch in Syria. And remember, this is where he starts all of his missionary journeys. He's writing to a defense of the gospel, that we are justified by our faith in Christ. And again, there is the key verse. Only thing you need to write down is the verse reference. You do not need to copy the whole verse over. I am not that cruel, but you just need to write down that verse setting. In this class, the speed of the class, we didn't have a lot of time to spend talking about each individual book and going into a lot of detail. I try to hit the highlights about the books, the important factors of the books. So please keep that in mind. But if you have questions about specific books or maybe things in a book that you've maybe read, don't understand, or you got questions about, don't hesitate to email me. I'd be happy to answer that. If you're on campus, stop by my office and sit down and we can discuss those. I hope you have a great day or night, depending on what time you're watching this video. And if you have questions, always feel free to email me.